small achievements that make a big impact in my life is when someone will come to me personally and say, thank you for teaching me this, I've learned, and now I know better, and now I can do better. I think the biggest achievements are also just speaking up at protests. A lot of activists around the world don't have that privilege and freedom of speech to speak their mind. So being able to stand up in front of crowds and speak your mind is firstly a privilege and also a big achievement when you once again hear people listening, you hear the press responding, you see it come out in articles.
Sarah, you're 17 and Kitumedze, you're 26. I'm wondering for both of you what you feel the defining values and elements of each of your respective generations' activisms are.
Okay. So firstly, I belong to the first cohort of the born frees, the generation that was just born after democracy in South Africa. And I think for a large, to a large extent, our activism is really centered and grounded around holding, our democratic government accountable, right? Hoping for a significant change in the living conditions of youth and just the population more broadly. So we do borrow a lot from the anti-apartheid struggle in terms of the music, the songs, the kind of the struggle songs that we sing, and also some of the organizing and mobilizing strategies. We're really still focused in terms of mass-based movement building, and this is quite evident with the Fees Must Fall student protests, across 26 institutions of higher learning, which saw university students demanding for free decolonized higher education. But of course, the success of, moments such as Fees Must Fall are largely attributed to digital and online activism and how that has also helped us in terms of shaping our own narratives.
Sarah, you know something about that. What would you like to add?
Gen Z, we grew up in the age of technology, the world of social media, and that came with a lot of benefits in terms of with mobilizing people internationally and especially now during a pandemic. What social media has also brought is lots of inclusivity because you're moving away from just that mainstream media narrative and you're embracing a diverse range of narratives and you getting to include so much more within your activism. So I think the inclusivity that social media has brought has been a key and defining factor with Gen Z.
South Africa's most recent youth-led mass movement was Fees Must Fall, which, as you mentioned earlier, was the fight to gain wider access for free and decolonized tertiary education. What do you think it was about that movement, Kitumedze, that made it resonate so widely with our generation?
I think a big part of Fees Must Fall, beyond issues of access, was really holding our government accountable to say, to what extent are you prepared to sacrifice an upcoming generation of young leaders and activists purely on the basis of, keeping or being deliberate about keeping a commodified, a capitalist, a racist system that continues to marginalize and exclude Black students specifically from institutions of higher learning.
Sarah, you were about 12 or 13 when this was unfolding on, the news media. What did it mean for you on a personal level to see young people really, rise up on such a mass scale?
It was really inspiring. It was watching history unfold right before my eyes. And while I didn't understand how complex the issue was back then, I understood the surface level of it. But diving into activism, the Fees Must Fall activists are one of the most inspiring activists that I look up to.
Did it give you permission to be angry as well?
Yes, 100%. And like I said before, that anger just ignites a passion to stand up and fight.
Kitumedze, as your t-shirt says, you are the founder, in fact, of the Black Women's Caucus, which among the many mandates you have is looking into eradicating gender-based violence. Can you talk to me about the myriad of violences that South African women right now are facing?
I mean, when we speak about gender-based violence, of course, you know, the most immediate understanding is around sexual and physical forms of violence, you know, and this makes sense. I mean, South Africa is seen as a rape capital globally. Not a pretty tag to have on, by the way. Our femicide rate is 5 times higher than the global average, right? And so our understanding around gender-based violence and femicide has really been within, you know, that conceptual framework. However, as Black Women Caucus, we're saying that it is a disservice for us to reduce gender-based violence and femicide to only physical and sexual forms of violence, you know, political violence, economic violence, environmental violence, social violence are all violences that contribute to the vulnerabilities of women. And it's important that when we find solutions and we propose solutions, that they must be multi-pronged and they must be cross-sectoral so that they're able to address the sources of the violence.
So can you give me an example of what that work looks like or how you bring these solutions to the public?
Of course. A lot of the stats and research done in South Africa around gender-based violence has attributed to a women's economic participation as a massive driver of vulnerability to gender-based violence and femicide. So in 2019, on the 13th of September, when we marched to the richest square mile in Africa, in Sandton, demanding greater participation from private sector in terms of, you know, their response to gender-based violence, we're ultimately saying you need to also be able to, you need to be held accountable for women's economic vulnerability, because largely when we think about rape and femicide, we always think about it within the confinements of the home, right? But the moment we made it a business issue, an economic issue, we're ultimately saying that the continuous subjugation and violation of women, number one, costs the South African economy between 20 and 40 billion rand annually, right? And that also means that part of our mobilization and advocacy requires us to make structural changes.
Sarah, it looks like you had something to add
Yeah,
there.
100%. It needs systemic change. If you're just bringing change on one surface, that surface is widespread. And in order for structural change to take place and the most effective change to take place, it needs to be systemic. It needs to be institutionalized. So also,
So we're addressing every level of the problem.
yes, 100%.
Sarah, you started Climate Warriors and you're a part of the Collective Movement. Tell me what Collective Movement is and what work you do with them.
So the Collective Movement is a youth-led intersectional climate group, and we aim to achieve climate justice through social justice and vice versa. So it's a group of young activists, and recently our work has all been on social media and online because of the pandemic. So this year we're working on climate change through a Pan-African context. So interviewing or having discussions with activists from Uganda and Kenya, and just broadening our perspective on climate change and how policy making takes place in different areas around the world and different challenges, and coming up with solutions. And then also spreading awareness and advocating and pushing forward the Climate Justice Charter movement to educate as many people on the climate change issue and exposing the intersectionality needed and bringing about inclusivity within the climate justice movement.
Why do you think, specifically in the South African context, that climate justice has taken a backseat to other issues, such as, you know, the ones that Kitumetse and I were talking about now?
So I think in the past, obviously, if you're looking at a pre-democratic South Africa, where people are fighting against the apartheid regime and fighting for liberation, climate change, understandably so, is going to take a backseat when you're fighting to be free in your own country. But if you're looking at a post-apartheid South Africa, where we're living in a democracy, I think there's a huge sense of apathy from those in power. That, firstly, the people in power putting profit before their people, we're stuck in this capitalist mindset. Another issue is the climate literacy rates in South Africa are extremely low, and that comes down to an educational issue. So apathy and the lack of climate literacy.
Cool. Kitumetse, what do you think are the intersections between climate justice and the other kinds of justice that, you know, your work strives for?
Really interesting, hey? I really like the fact that, bridging climate justice with social justice. And I think for a long time, we've thought about climate justice as a standalone kind of, struggle. It's like sitting there in the corner and nobody really wants to deal with it. But what has been very important and has been quite a big eye-opener for me, myself as a feminist, is the work we've been doing in informal settlements and how when you spoke about literacy, environmental literacy, how, we're still struggling to make the connections at community level between the environment and social justice. For an example, one of the communities that we work in is called Kathrada Park Informal Settlement. Poor water and sanitation, breakdown in infrastructure, and just listening to you, I can already see, how climate justice fits into that, right? But I do believe that to a large extent, the climate justice movement has positioned itself as quite a white elitist movement, right? It has struggled to deal with the very concrete conditions that an ordinary person in South Africa is facing. But I think in a country like South Africa, we need to be able to root and ground our ideology and our advocacy in the lived experiences of people on a day-to-day basis.
Sarah, what do you say to that?
Climate change for the longest time has seemed like a very privileged issue. If I'm struggling to put food on my plate, why should I care about the air quality? Why should I care about litter on the beach? And I think that comes down to the need for climate-conscious media. And with climate-conscious media, inclusivity, so looking at climate change across the world. And also understanding that solutions that may work in the West aren't going to work in Africa. For various reasons, we have different economies, different policies, different governments, different histories. It just won't fit. And I think what's very vital when looking at climate justice and climate change is looking at it through an intersectional lens. So instead of separating the environmental factors and the social factors, bridging them together, because climate justice and social justice intrinsically linked together to bring about positive change. By tackling one, that solution is going to affect the other in either a positive or negative way, depending on what the solution is. So if you're looking at climate change, geographically, climate change is going to disproportionately affect poorer Black communities. So within your activism, within climate activism, you need to take into account classism, racism, sexism, homophobia. For example, if a natural disaster were to strike, those communities would be most vulnerable. And if you look at the way society treats those communities now, imagine how much worse it's going to be when aid due to natural disaster is needed and needs to be brought to those communities. So advocating for human rights, you can't pick and choose. No form of oppression exists in isolation.
I wonder what you both think, the possibility of achieving your ideas of what a just world looks like. What do you think the implications of capitalism has on the work that you do? Kitumeze?
What I'm picking up is that capitalism inherently, glorifies the individual. Its limitations, however, in activism is that activism is not a one-man show. Right? And unfortunately, capitalism has created and it continues to co-opt civic action and civic interventions and presents them as one-man shows, right? Where we have this martyr that comes out, this internet sensation that comes out and is going to save the world, And I think what that does is that it breaks down organic movement building strategies, right? I don't think we have any strong, tangible movements that are being, nurtured. But instead, what we're seeing individual activists rising. And listen, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have the pop stars of a movement emerge. They're important. They keep the movement fun and dynamic. But I do think it's important that we root our activism in communities, because these alternative realities that we want, this anti-capitalist reality that we want, this feminist intersectional reality that we want, is not going to be fostered by an individual. It needs an active, it needs active efforts from a collective in order to drive that mandate. And I think this is some of the critiques of capitalism infiltrating civic and activist work.
Yeah, 100%. Community-based change is the most sustainable and effective change in the long run. If you're looking at capitalism, in a capitalistic world, the most ideal position you can be in right now is to be a white man. And that breaks down so much. It breaks down the feminist movement, it breaks down any movement led by women. Capitalism breeds a system of inequality.
Of course.
It's always going to be, if I'm winning, someone else is losing. And like you said, it's a very individual, it glorifies individual work. And that is extremely problematic. It's also very problematic to have one face represent a whole movement, because it excludes people that don't match that face, that don't match that demographic. So yeah, definitely not. Carbon capitalism is the main cause to our climate crisis.
Sorry, can I just add on to that? I'm reflecting. Reflecting is such an important aspect of growing. And as activists, we should never stop reflecting. And when I think about, the anti-apartheid movement, firstly, I know for a fact that many people who participated in those movements, in those forms of resistance, were not participating because they were individuals that they were idolizing. It's because they felt a strong sense of personhood. I mean, the issue is affecting me directly. Therefore, I need to actively participate in finding the solutions. And I think, the idea of the glorifying of the individual robs us of that. Yeah. And I think our communities are there to hold us grounded, to hold us accountable, and to make sure that we are working and living within the ideals of the movements that we represent.
Well, I guess in closing, I'm curious if it's not clear so far, what you both hope to achieve, and if you feel optimistic about, being able to actually achieve those things. Kitumetse?
I'm a perpetual optimist, firstly, as a disclaimer. So I definitely do think things will get better. I do think that, we need to intensify our demands and struggles, but also change our sides of oppression and fighting, right? I think so many times, what activism and how we traditionally know activism to be is that we take to the streets, right, to get our messages across. And although that is important, we also need to see some radical advancement and transformation in the policy and governance sphere. Right? And so as Black Women Caucus, at the heart of the solutions that we propose as a social movement is the realization and strengthening of feminist movements which are going to foster feminist leadership. We need to see an emergence of new radical feminist leaders really shaping the world to where we want to take it, right? And I honestly believe that we've got the right energies, we've got the minds, we've got the hearts, and let's do it.
Sarah?
Like I said earlier, I have climate anxiety, and the only thing I can cling onto with that climate anxiety is optimism towards the future. It drives me to constantly wake up and make the decision that this is what I'd like to change, and this is where, that quote, be the change you want to see and advocate for the change that you'd like to see. So I think a main goal is to just get the same urgency that we are carrying today, with sending that to the hearts of our government and our leadership to demand a climate emergency and to attack all of these social issues that we've unpacked today. Because once again, social justice is climate justice and vice versa. So yeah, I think unification needs to take place, like today, between the generations, and just, keep the energy, don't let it die. I feel growing up with social media, you see activism turns into a trend, and it breeds a lot of performative activism. And every year and every month, there's a new hashtag and something new is trending. And instead of treating activism and social issues as a trend, keeping that advocacy a long, constant action that lives within your heart.
Sarah, Kitumetse, thank you so much for joining me on Generation Change.
Thank you.
Investigative journalism.
My role in this fight might be in information battle.
Global experts in discussion.
The pandemic didn't create all of these problems. It showed us our true colors.
Voices from different corners.
We don't need to sensationalize how we tell these stories. What journalists do best is look at the heart of the story.
Programs that open your eyes to an alternative view of the world today. On Al Jazeera.
Did you know you can watch Al Jazeera English streaming live on our YouTube channel? Plus thousands of our programs, award-winning documentaries, and in-depth news reports. Subscribe to YouTube/Al Jazeera English.
Al Jazeera, wherever you are.
US senators agree on a bipartisan gun control deal, but it falls short of tougher steps sought by President Joe Biden. Hello, I'm Emily Angwin. This is Al Jazeera Live from Doha. Also coming up, France votes for a new parliament with projections putting Emmanuel Macron's party neck and neck with the United Left-Wing Alliance. The biggest bloc in Iraq's parliament resigns, tipping the country into more uncertainty after an 8-month deadlock over forming a government. And while the search continues, hopes are fading of finding 2 men missing in the Brazilian Amazon. Hello and welcome to the program. We begin in the US, where a bipartisan group of senators has agreed on a framework for new gun control laws. It's aimed at curbing rising gun violence. The main proposals include funding to help the states create and administer red flag laws to keep weapons out of the hands of dangerous individuals. Buyers under 21 years of age would be subject to tougher background checks, including their mental health records, and funding would be provided for enhanced mental health services in communities and schools. It comes a day after tens of thousands of people took part in marches across the country calling for stricter gun controls following a spate of recent shootings. Last month, an 18-year-old gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers in an attack on a primary school in Texas. President Joe Biden has hailed the proposals as important steps. For more on this, let's bring in Mike Hanna, who's live for us in Washington, D.C. Hello there, Mike. How much of a breakthrough really is this?
Well, when one remembers that there hasn't been any bipartisan agreement on gun control for some 3 decades, then it's very significant indeed. President Biden has issued a text saying, welcoming the announcement, saying that more could be done, but it's an important step forward. And certainly this is the general reaction from many groups that it is an important step forward, that it is a signal that bipartisan agreement on this issue can be reached. But it falls far short of what many, including President Biden, were demanding. For example, there's no outright ban on automatic weapons. There's no raising the age at which one can buy a rifle from 18 to 21. These were issues that were being demanded at those rallies you referred to across the US on the course of Saturday. So certainly there's going to be some intense criticism of these measures, despite the fact that generally they could be regarded as a breakthrough.
So, Mike, could this lead to further gun control measures going forward?
Well, the short answer to that is simply no. If the political situation remains as it is, the Republicans, the 10 Republicans who've signed this framework agreement, have done so on the condition that it is moderate measures. Any further measures, such as increasing the age of buying a weapon or a ban on assault rifles, would be resisted by most Republicans. What this means is that such legislation would not be able to pass through Senate in its current configuration, where 10 Republican votes are needed to meet the supermajority, the 60 votes that would be needed to pass any gun control legislation. So if the Senate composition stays as it is, this is the limit, one would assume, that gun control measures will take. But that could change if the Senate's composition changes in midterm elections. And this is what gun control advocates are focusing on, saying that if senators do not accept a wider, more meaningful gun control reforms, then they will face the consequences at the midterm elections in November.
OK, thank you for breaking it all down for us, Mike Hanna, live for us in Washington. Speaking of those gun reform advocates, Christina Delgado says there are opportunities for Congress to do more.
These measures are really fantastic measures. They are incremental movements forward, and are also vitally necessary. But, you know, coming from a community that actually survived one of these horrific school shootings, it definitely makes us feel like we're still left in the dark. I do feel that we can do more. You know, as a gun-owning family, these practices that we're asking for, such as Ethan's Law, Kimberly's Law, the education in safe storage, the education in responsible ownership, and penalties for those individuals who are acting in negligence would not affect any responsible gun owner that I know, or even my family. It's really kind of hard for some of us to understand why it's so difficult to put these penalties in to really define those negligent people from us responsible gun owners. You know, it's an unfortunate reality that we live here in the US, but it does not have to be this way forever. These are incremental changes that are vastly important that we do come through and pass. But just as, you know, what was discussed prior to coming here to this moment, this is simply a draft. This is not the final draft to be passed right away. So there is still time for these members of the Senate to have discussions to really take into consideration other ways that we can improve these different titles in this bill.
To France now, where President Emmanuel Macron's coalition and its left-wing rival are neck and neck in the first round of France's legislative elections. Projections suggest Macron's Ensemble alliance should win more seats, but they're at risk of losing their majority in the National Assembly. Macron will need to hang on to that majority to press ahead with planned reforms. He faces competition from a left-wing alliance led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Second stage voting will take place next Sunday. Let's take a closer look at that now. There are 577 seats in the National Assembly. 289 seats are needed to win an absolute majority. The new parliament won't be clear until next Sunday's second round. The latest projections have President Macron's Ensemble alliance looking like it will win between 255 and 295 seats. The left-wing alliance, led by Mélenchon, is projected to win between 150 and 190 seats, while the UDC alliance, the union of the right and the centre, looks set to win 50 to 80 seats. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally and its allies should win between 20 to 45. Natasha Butler is in Paris with more on the results.
Well, for the French President Emmanuel Macron, what is at stake is how he'll be able to govern over the next 5 years. The makeup of the parliament is absolutely crucial. Now, the estimated results from this first round in this parliamentary election indicate that his centrist alliance certainly seems to be ahead in terms of the amount of seats that it would be able to win in the parliament after a second round, perhaps next week. However, what it does also what the results also show is that Macron may not win a majority. His party may not win a majority, and that would be a problem for Macron because he wouldn't necessarily then be able to push ahead with his reformist agenda. The main challenger, really, to Emmanuel Macron's centrist alliance is this new left-wing bloc, this new left-wing alliance that is made up of socialists, communists and Greens. It was created by the far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon after the presidential election, which he came third. And it's captured the imagination of particularly younger voters because it's very much focused on issues such as climate change, but also the cost of living. Now, of course, this left-wing alliance are looking at the results. It is a huge victory for them tonight. They are hoping very much that they can build on those results, on the momentum, and possibly push through to the second round and see themselves have a majority. But most analysts say that it's still likely that Macron's centrist alliance would have a majority of seats in the parliament, but whether or not it has an absolute majority that would give it the power to be able to give Macron the power that he needs to push ahead with his agenda really remains to be seen, of course.
Members of the largest political bloc in Iraq's parliament have resigned after 8 months of deadlock over forming a government. It follows a request from their leader, the Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. On Thursday, he threatened to withdraw from parliament if a national majority government can't be formed. By Sunday, he resigned with 72 more lawmakers.
Iraq does not need the formation of a government, but an effective government whose majority serves its people, returns its glory and obedience to God. So let our beloved Sadrist bloc members write their resignations from parliament.
For more analysis on this, let's bring in Randa Slim, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and she joins me live from Ohio. Randa, thanks so much for being on the program. What do these resignations mean for the country, which, as we mentioned, has witnessed that political deadlock for 8 months now?
Well, it threatens to push the country into chaos, into civil unrest, into street violence. So it plunges the country really into a dark tunnel, even after this month of stalemate, which we thought were a dark period. I think where the country is heading is in an even darker period.
So what's next? How will these 73 members who've quit be replaced?
Well, according to the ruling by the Federal Supreme Court in November 2021, every member who has been resigned and whose resignation has been accepted, which is the case with the 72 members from the Sadrist coalition, will be replaced by the highest vote getter after that member. And if you look at the election outcomes, definitely this means more seats to be gained by the State of Law group, which is headed by Mr. Nour al-Maliki, by groups that are affiliated with the Popular Mobilization Forces. So it's going to strengthen the hand of this coalition, which is a pro-Iran coalition, in the parliament, and maybe eventually paving the way for this coalition to form the next government.
So given everything you've just said there, what's the rationale behind al-Sadr's move? What's he trying to achieve?
That's what I've been trying to figure out since I heard the decision. Look, he has threatened that he's going to take this move days ago, but I don't think people took his threat seriously. And today he's just suddenly, acted on this, and we see the video of the Speaker of the Parliament accepting and signing on the resignation of the 72 Sadrist MPs. And so I've been trying to figure out what's Sadr's play. What is he going to gain from this? What does he think is his next move? Because he has to have a next move. What does he think the other side, his opponents will react? Does he want to be pushed out of the parliament, really? He has not been out of the parliament since 2006. And so it's hard to figure out his play, and then it's hard to figure out his next move.
As you mentioned, there are concerns that these resignations could cause tensions to boil over and for people to take to the streets. These decisions are only sort of happened in the last little while. So what's the mood there? What are you hearing in terms of whether or not people will protest?
I mean, lots of tension, lots of uncertainty. There has been some reporting that some of the media websites which are affiliated with the Sadrists have already started to call for protest. I mean, so there is a fear that we might go back to the kind of violence that was present in 2019, which really brought the country to the brink of another civil war. Like in 2005, 2006. So, I mean, there is a lot of tension and confusion, and there is a lot of concern, again, about what are going to be Mr. Muqtada Sadr's next move and what will his followers do, which count in the millions of Iraqis.
OK, we'll be watching it very closely, this story, how it unfolds. Thank you very much for your analysis, Randa Slim, a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute.
Thank you.
Moving on now, an Al Jazeera media network continues to demand a rapid, independent and transparent investigation into the killing of its journalist in the occupied West Bank. Shireen Abu Akleh was shot in the head by Israeli forces while she was on assignment in Jenin. On the day of her funeral, Israeli forces stormed the procession and started beating mourners, causing pallbearers to almost drop her casket. That didn't stop thousands of Palestinians from marching through occupied East Jerusalem to take part in her funeral and burial. Members of the international community have condemned her killing and continued to call for an investigation. Shireen was with Al Jazeera for 25 years, covering the story of the Israeli occupation. She was known as the voice of Palestine. Still ahead on Al Jazeera, a Russian strike in eastern Ukraine sets a chemical plant on fire where hundreds are reportedly sheltering inside. And Sri Lanka's economic crisis deepens as the cash-strapped government puts caps on how much petrol people can buy.
Hello there. Let's look to North America, and it's been about the exceptional heat across southern areas of the US. Death Valley recorded 50 degrees over the weekend, and we are going to see that heat continue, but temperatures will dip down slightly. We've got some hot, blustery winds blowing about those southern states, but much of the weather action is happening further north of this. We've got flood warnings out for some of the states in the northern plains as that wet and windy weather pushes its way further east and up in the north. That's thanks to an area of low pressure that's bringing some wintry and wet conditions once again to the Canadian prairies. It is going to cool down across the west coast. We've got coastal wind warnings out for California, and we are going to see a bit of a cool down for that east coast as that wetter weather works its way over. Some severe storms expected here, moving across Pennsylvania and into the Virginias. Some severe storms as well affecting the Midwest, pushing towards the Great Lakes. For the quieter picture, we have to head further south with just some showers affecting the southeast corner. It's hot down in the south, however, as it is for much of northern Mexico as we move to Central America. But we're going to see a real drenching in southern areas thanks to a disturbance off the coast, with some of the heaviest rain falling in Costa Rica.
The Sheikh Hamad Award for Translation and International Understanding is accepting nominations for the year 2022 from February 15th until August 15th this year. For more information, go to www.hta.qa/en.
Hello, you're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Emily Angwin. Here's a reminder of our top stories this hour. A bipartisan group of US senators have agreed on a framework for modest gun restrictions in the wake of a series of mass shootings. Under the tentative deal, authorities would keep guns away from people deemed to be a threat. French President Emmanuel Macron's coalition and its left-wing rival are neck and neck in the first round of France's legislative elections. He faces competition from a left alliance led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And Iraqi politician Muqtada al-Sadr has resigned from parliament with 72 more members of his political party. He says it was to break an 8-month political deadlock after no party could form a majority government. To Ukraine now, where Russian forces have blown up a bridge that linked the embattled eastern city of Severodonetsk with Lysychansk across the river. Severodonetsk is in the Luhansk region of Ukraine. The Russian attack leaves just one of 3 bridges in the area still standing. Local officials say that's limiting possible evacuation routes for civilians. Hundreds of fighters and residents are thought to be sheltering in the Azot chemical plant, which takes up a large area along the western side of Severodonetsk. A Russian state news agency has shared footage it says shows smoke rising from the plant. The governor of Luhansk province says fuel storage and chemicals there have caught fire. He also said Russian shelling has killed 1 woman and destroyed 4 houses and a shopping centre in Lysychansk. Charles Stratford has more on this from the capital, Kyiv.
We came off the phone to a Ukrainian deputy commander inside that city, Severodonetsk, one of only 2 cities now that is not under full Russian control in the Lugansk region of Donbass. That deputy commander saying to us that, yes, there had been heavy shelling of that chemical plant and that it was on fire. That chemical plant, a vast, great Soviet-built industrial complex that before the war used to produce fertilizers and building material. It's located in the southeast of the city, we understand, close to the river that separates the town of Severodonetsk from the town of Lysychansk, which he tells us is also getting heavily shelled. We asked him whether he could confirm reports that we've been hearing over the last couple of days about hundreds of civilians sheltering underneath that chemical plant in Severodonetsk. He was unable to confirm that. He estimates that up to 2,000 civilians may have died in Severodonetsk amidst this heavy fighting. Now, this comes at a time when the Ukrainians are complaining again that they don't have enough weapons from the West, and those Western weapons that they have been allocated are not getting here fast enough. So there are huge concerns yet again today for basically Ukrainians' ability to be able to defend that city, and for the up to what we understand could be around 10,000 civilians either trapped inside that city or unwilling to leave.
The family of missing British journalist Dom Phillips say their hopes of finding him alive are gone. Phillips and Indigenous rights expert Bruno Pereira disappeared in a remote part of the Amazon. Monica Yanakiev reports from a vigil in Rio de Janeiro, marking 1 week since they were last seen.
A vigil for British journalist Dom Phillips and Indigenous expert Bruno Pereira. Family, friends and colleagues of the pair gathered in Rio de Janeiro, demanding to know what's happened to them. They went missing a week ago in the Javari Valley, an area in the Amazon twice the size of Japan and home to the largest number of uncontacted tribes in the world. The vigil was held on Copacabana Beach, the place where Phillips used to paddle surf before moving to northeastern Brazil to write a book about saving the Amazon. He was on his way back from an expedition with Pereira when both men disappeared. Human remains were reportedly found where the pair was last seen, but they are still being identified.
This was Dom's last trip there. He told my sister, his wife Alessandra, that he needed one more interview to finish his book. I think Dom went to the Amazon because he belonged there. He's an Englishman who was born in the wrong place. He loved the rainforest and their inhabitants.
Pereira used to work for FUNAI, the government agency responsible for protecting Brazil's indigenous people.
Bruno was forced to leave the agency because he did not agree with President Jair Bolsonaro's policy of opening up the Amazon for commercial exploitation and leaving it unprotected. There are only 1,400 people in our agency, and we have to protect 1 million indigenous people occupying an area that represents 13% of Brazil's territory.
Pereira started working on his own with the Javari tribes. We accompanied him during an expedition several months ago in the same area where he was last seen with Dom Phillips. Pereira was already being threatened because he was helping local tribes collect evidence of the invasions to their territories and report them to local authorities.
At first, we were very hopeful that both men were alive because Dom was with Bruno, who is very experienced. The family thought they must have been ambushed, but managed to hide the boat and escape through the forest. But a week has gone by, and our hopes are diminishing. All we want now is for them to be found. We have a right to know what happened to them.
This march is not only to put pressure on the government to find writer Dom Phillips and indigenous expert Bruno Pereira. It's also for a bigger cause. People here say both men defended saving the Amazon. Monica Yanakiev, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
India's ruling BJP has been accused of intimidation. That's after properties linked to Muslim protesters were demolished in the state of Uttar Pradesh. It follows days of rallies against two former BJP officials who made remarks against the Prophet Muhammad that many consider offensive. Victoria Gatenby reports.
A bulldozer demolishes the home of a Muslim politician and activist. Authorities in the state of Uttar Pradesh say Mohammed Javid didn't have planning permission.
2 people involved in the violent protests have been identified, and it was found they had illegal constructions and bulldozers were brought in. We will also charge them under the National Security Act.
Javid's family say he wasn't at the protests and accuse the governing BJP of trying to intimidate them.
We've been paying our house tax for around 20 years, and not once have we received any intimation by any development authorities of Allahabad that our house is illegal, or why were they even taking our taxes if it was an illegal house indeed.
Properties linked to Muslim protesters were also demolished on Saturday. The demolitions followed days of protests against 2 former BJP officials who made remarks against the Prophet Muhammad that many consider offensive. Protesters want one of them, Nupur Sharma, arrested for hate speech. The party's head of media in New Delhi, Naveen Kumar Jindal, is also accused of making insulting remarks. Some protests turned violent on Friday, but legal experts say authorities cannot use that as a justification for destroying people's homes.
You cannot demolish a man's house for protesting. You cannot link it to the protests. These are 2 different things altogether. So it is, in my view, an abuse of power.
The BJP says it strongly denounces insults against any religion, sect or ideology. But protesters don't believe that statement and say these demolitions speak louder than words. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
9 people have been arrested in China after a violent attack on several women in a restaurant. Surveillance footage shows a man slapping a woman who'd rebuffed him. She fought back, then a group of men entered the restaurant in northern Hebei province, attacking her and the other women with her. The woman who'd rejected the man's advances was then dragged outside and beaten while others looked on. Sri Lanka's energy minister says further rationing of fuel is likely to begin by the first week of July. The amount of petrol and diesel people can put in their cars and motorbikes is already limited. The country's worst economic crisis in more than 70 years has left motorists spending days in queues for fuel. Manel Fernandez reports from Colombo.
Mercy Pereira is struggling to keep the home fires burning. For 35 years, she has been making and selling string hoppers, a popular Sri Lankan staple. But with food prices skyrocketing, cooking gas and kerosene unavailable, she's struggling.
I have to look after 8 people. I manage all the expenses with what I make, even the water and electricity bills. If costs increase more than this, I just can't go on.
Mercy is not alone. Most Sri Lankans are reeling as food inflation has raced past 50%.
I found some items about 3 times more than even last week. Yeah. So it's always, every day it's going up.
The person who bought kilos before now buys 250 grams. Things are at rock bottom.
The United Nations says the country's economic crisis has affected food security, agriculture, livelihoods, and access to health services. Its World Food Programme says 3 out of 4 families are badly affected.
They're cutting back on meals, they're cutting back on the portions of those meals, and they're buying food that's much cheaper but much less nutritious.
The UN and non-government organizations are appealing for almost $50 million for what they describe as life-saving assistance to the worst-hit people. But there are bigger concerns.
My fear is that there is a much larger portion of the population who will very soon need the same kind of assistance unless there's a fundamental change in the situation here.
There's little sign of that at present. Fuel supplies are running low. Thousands of Sri Lankans queue for hours, sometimes days. Energy Minister Kanchana Wijesekara says he has no choice but to introduce a weekly quota for registered consumers. Many people waiting in queues told Al Jazeera they don't believe this will work. Another group fed up with shortages took to the streets, banging pots and pans and kitchen utensils, demanding President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his latest government step down.
The government is trying desperately to find a solution to the crisis, but must meet stringent conditions before it can secure a bailout. These don't mean much for the tens of thousands of people struggling to put food on the table. Minna Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Colombo.
Britain's Queen Elizabeth has become the world's second longest reigning modern monarch. Crowned in 1953, she's now overtaken Thailand's former king, who reigned for 70 years and 126 days until his death in 2016. France's Louis XIV remains the longest ruling monarch. He spent 72 years and 110 days on the throne from the mid-1600s. Hello, you're watching Al Jazeera. These are the top stories this hour. A bipartisan group of US senators has agreed on a framework for modest gun restrictions in the wake of a series of mass shootings. Under the tentative deal, authorities would keep guns away from people deemed to be a threat. Mike Hanna has more from Washington, D.C.
President Biden has issued a text saying, welcoming the announcement, saying that more could be done, but it's an important step forward. And certainly this is the general reaction from many groups, that it is an important step forward, that it is a signal that bipartisan agreement on this issue can be reached. But it falls far short of what many, including President Biden, were demanding. For example, there's no outright ban on automatic weapons. There's no raising the age at which one can buy a rifle from 18 to 21.
French President Emmanuel Macron's coalition and its left-wing rival are neck and neck in the first round of France's legislative elections. He faces competition from a left alliance led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Iraqi politician Muqtada al-Sadr has resigned from parliament with 72 more members of his political party. He says it was to break an 8-month political deadlock after no party could form a majority government. A Russian state news agency has shared footage it says shows smoke rising from a plant. The governor of Luhansk province says fuel storage and chemicals there have caught fire, putting the lives of those hiding there at risk. A vigil has been held in Rio de Janeiro, marking 1 week since a leading Brazilian Indigenous expert and a British journalist went missing in the Amazon. Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips disappeared near the Javari Valley Indigenous Territory. And Sri Lanka is imposing weekly quotas to limit the amount of fuel people can buy. Motorists have been spending days waiting in queues at petrol stations. Sri Lanka is suffering its worst economic crisis since independence. So those are the headlines. I'm Emily Angwin. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after the stream.
We understand the differences and similarities of cultures across the world. So no matter where you call home, Al Jazeera will bring you the news and current affairs that matter to you. Al Jazeera.
Shireen's killing is the story, the same story she was telling. The difference is that this time the world knew the victim. We are not being killed because of what we do, but because of who we are. We are not being killed by mistake, but as part of a grand design, aiming to make sure we all understand no one is safe, so that we all live with fear in our hearts and surrender.
That was Palestinian-American diplomat Riyad Mansour speaking at the United Nations 2 weeks ago. June the 11th marks 1 month since the murder of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh by Israeli forces. At the time, there was international outrage and condemnation, but who will be held accountable for her death? Today on the stream, we continue to honour the life of our colleague as we bring you the latest efforts to secure justice for Shireen. Let's meet your panel. Hello, Lena, Yasmin and Nida. So good to have you on the stream today. Lena, please introduce yourself to our viewers around the world.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lena Abu Akleh. I'm Shireen's niece.
Good to have you. Hello, Yasmin. Welcome to the stream. Tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin Serhan, and I'm a London-based staff writer for The Atlantic.
Thanks for being with us. And a familiar face if you watch Al Jazeera News all of the time. Nida, welcome back to the stream. Please remind our audience who you are and what you do.
My name is Nida Ibrahim, and I'm Al Jazeera's correspondent to the occupied West Bank.
All right, so audience, you have seen the lineup. They have expertise in this tragic area of the justice for Shireen Abu Akleh. What would you like to ask them? You can ask them anything. Comment section is right here. Be part of today's show. Lena, this last month, wow, it went so fast. What has it been like for you and your family?
First and foremost, thank you for having me on the show. It's still so difficult to comprehend that it's been a month. We still haven't processed that this is the reality, that we know I will no longer see Shireen on TV reporting, that I will no longer be spending my weekends with Shireen. It's been very tough, to say the least. It's been a difficult tragedy that was a loss not just to our family, but to the entire nation and to the entire world. We've received overwhelming amount of support and love from everyone, not just Palestinians, but people from all over the world. And that just goes on to show that Shireen was loved by everyone. Shireen was a people's person. She entered everyone's homes through the TV screen. And the same way that she carried the stories of all the people, how she brought to life all the stories of the Palestinians, we saw on the